Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Office of DEI at DeSales University's the Latinx Experience webinar this afternoon. Really glad that you're able to join us. Before we start, a couple of things we'd like to be able to acknowledge. First is, of course, we are here to celebrate and to honor Latin Hispanic Heritage Month, and that's, of course, the focus for our conversation this afternoon. We also would like to acknowledge that DeSales University is on the indigenous lands of the Lenni Lenape. We acknowledge with respect the people of the Lenni Lenape, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral lands DeSales University now stands. We honor them and their many contributions to the world around us, including the original philosophy and practice of environmental stewardship. Respecting the call of Pope Francis and Laudato Si', we strive to show special care for indigenous communities and their cultural traditions. Now, I'm going to sashay over to the role as a panelist for this afternoon's discussion. It's my honor and privilege to introduce the graduate assistant in the Office of DEI, Naomy Diaz-Sierra, who will serve as our moderator for this afternoon's discussion. Naomy, the microphone is all yours.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. So first we have here Dr. Vivian Robledo Shori. She is the Director of Student Services and Minority Affairs for the Bethlehem Area School District, and a Latina, Viva Puerto Rico. Dr. Robledo and leads the work of creating equitable and anti-racist informed approaches to supporting students and their families throughout the area and within the Bethlehem Area School District. Welcome, Vivian.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Mr. Scott Blair is the Associate Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at DeSales University and Latino via Venezuela. Blair leads the inclusivity efforts at DeSales with a focus on faculty support in creating diverse and inclusive approaches to teaching, student support, and inclusive hiring, to name a few. We are glad to have him as a panelist this evening. Welcome, Scott. We also have with us Donray Bennett. He is an Associate Director for Admissions at Kutztown University and is also representing Puerto Ricans this afternoon. In addition to his work at Kutztown, Donna Ray is a dedicated advocate for underrepresented college-bound students and families and a former K-12 administrator in the charter school space in Columbus, Ohio, for over 10 years before pivoting to higher education. Great to have you with us, Mr. Bennett. And welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you all for being here today.
Oh, you're on mute, Naomi.
All right, here we go. Sorry about that. Our first question. You all have your unique individual story and Latin heritage and culture that has influenced your personality and professionally. You personally and professionally, excuse me. Could you share some of your background with our attendees and your pull towards education as professionals? Scott, if you can have that first.
Happy to do so, Naomi. And yeah, I was looking at Dr. and Donray. I think we were all wondering who was going to go in first. For me, what I'll share is, you know, I was born and raised as a little guy, if you will, in Venezuela. I was born in Caracas. My mother's family is indigenous to South America, to Venezuela. And of course, as anyone with Latin heritage, most of us have that indigenous lineage and ancestry in us. We have some of the islands in us as well, the Tejano, and then obviously looking at our African lineage because of the slave trade, right? So we need to speak to that. I think we're going to talk about that with an upcoming question. But when I moved to the States at about the age of 6, Spanish is my first language. So I was jumping into kindergarten without knowing any English and having to really learn on the fly before ESL was even a thing, right? And at the time I had hair and I identified, you know, I'm brown skinned. I had dark brown curly hair. I stood out and I sounded different. So from an early age, I was informed in a number of different ways that I was different from everybody else and trying to understand what that meant. And especially over time, as I lost my language, I lost Spanish because growing up in the 80s and the 90s, it was more about assimilation as opposed to valuing your culture. So all of that really played a huge role into my identity development as a child. And it really wasn't until I became an educator and in my graduate school experience in which I was able to understand my place in the field. Because when I would speak sometimes with my Latino brothers and sisters, I wasn't Latin enough because I didn't speak the language. But I wasn't white either, right? So I had this pull in a number of different directions, and in a lot of ways that helped inform my pull into education, because as I was kind of navigating these spaces, it was many teachers that were seeing me genuinely and authentically and gave me that space to be myself. And as an educator, I wanted to be able to give back. So in a lot of ways, my life journey as a child helped to inform where I am now as a professional.
Thank you, Scott. Doctora?
So born and raised in Bethlehem, south side of Bethlehem. So I am that built by Bethlehem, you know, the slogan of BASD. I didn't always know what that meant. I tell people all the time, I grew up in the south side. I lived right across the street from Dunnigan Elementary School, where I went to elementary school. I grew up with 3 male cousins, no brothers and sisters that I grew up with, but I do have half brothers and sisters that I believe are my true brothers and sisters, but didn't know them until I was older. And my grandmother. So we had the extended family living in the one house. So I learned Spanish because my grandmother did not speak English. My mom came here very young. She knew English. My aunt knew English, but at home we all spoke Spanish, except my uncle, who was German heritage, that married my aunt. So very weird. I grew up watching Yeehaw, Hee Haw, what's the polka show, all of those things while listening to R&B because my cousins DJ'd and did all that stuff, and salsa. So I knew it all, had it all growing up. And Dunnigan was mainly Latino, mainly Puerto Rican at that time, some other groups because Southside was very much immigrant area, right? They worked in the steel mills, the factories. My mom was a factory worker. My aunt was a factory worker. Then I went to Brockle, same kind of atmosphere. So it wasn't until I moved to Freedom High School as my high school, while all my cousins before me went to Liberty, the line changed by the time I got older to go to high school, is when I really experienced what it was like to, one, not be as well off as everyone. I would never say I was poor, but that I knew that I wasn't well off. Around Freedom, big single homes. Although I lived in a single home on the south side, it was not the same. I remember experiencing going to the office and a parent dropping off keys to a 16-year-old's first car when they first got their license. I didn't have a car until I got to college. I didn't know what that experience was. So that's where I first experienced a cultural shift and a class shift. But it wasn't until college that I really was able to dig deep into what did it mean to be Puerto Rican, really, historically, not culturally. They made sure I knew that growing up at home. The language, the food, the music, being proud to be Puerto Rican, being proud to be all three. And I know we're going to get into this a little bit later, but you were proud of being all three, not one more than the other. But historically, what that meant to be Puerto Rican, what it meant to be Latino, did not happen until I got to college. My track or trajectory into education didn't happen until I became an admissions counselor at ESU. So higher ed was my first step in to education. And I was an admissions recruiter out in Pittsburgh. And I remember, I just told the story the other day that the students, the high school students that came down said no one ever really talked to them about college. They were coming down to miss class. They didn't want to be in class. And then when they were leaving, they dropped the red bags that we gave them to carry the college material in. And when I stopped one and asked why, they said because they live in Crip territory. They couldn't take red bags in the neighborhood. That, coupled with a couple other incidents, told me I needed to go back to get my master's in counseling so that I can get into education, to start way earlier than in admissions. I felt, yes, it was a good point and a good entry for some, but way too late for a lot of others. So I was able to come back to Bethlehem as a school counselor at Brockle, where I went to school. So that was my entryway into education, and been here since 23 years. So.
Thank you, Doctora. Donray?
Wow, that was insightful, Doctora. So I'm half Black and half Puerto Rican, and I grew up in North Philadelphia in a section that was affectionately referred to as Little Puerto Rico. It was overwhelmingly Puerto Rican, or at least Latino families there. But my household included, you know, a couple aunts, a lot of cousins, grandparents, and it was all the Puerto Rican side of my family. So I grew up with that side. I actually didn't get to know my father's side, the Black side, until I was about 16 or so. And so that's all I knew, the cultural piece, as Doctora referenced. And however, the Spanish piece didn't develop till later. Now, my grandparents didn't speak much English at the time, so I understood it, but they were also trying to learn English. So I was allowed to respond in English. And so as many folks that over the course of time, I found similar experiences, I understood it, but didn't speak it very well. And while I always identified as both Black and Puerto Rican, clearly, well, I shouldn't say clearly, but to many folks, they did not see the Puerto Rican side. I was Black, although culturally speaking, I had only known the ways of my Puerto Rican family. And so it really wasn't until college that I got to experience that side as well. But what I found was there's a lot of commonality, and there's a lot of things that came natural to me that I was always felt different for, or my family made me feel special, but in essence, I was different for. And I started seeing those commonalities within the Black culture a lot. And that's when it really all came together for me. But I always identified as both, regardless of what the environment or circumstances may have tried to dictate. It's just as always, I've just always had tremendous pride in both sets. But Doctora hit on a very key piece, which is I never really understood either sides of my culture, but especially the Puerto Rican side historically. It's not taught. At least to some degree, although minimal, to some degree, there's some Black history that is more readily available through the K-12 system. Puerto Rican history is just non-existent, at least in my experience. And so it wasn't until I became parts of organizations on campus and started doing some of those things on my own that I got to know it. But the true edification occurred once I went to Honduras for a couple of years. And I'll talk a little more detail about that a little later, but you know, my reasoning for going there, we're going to why a little later, but part of it was to develop the Spanish language. And I don't subscribe to the idea that speaking Spanish has anything to do with your cultural significance or anything of that nature. But I did have an intrinsic motivation to be able to speak with my grandparents before they passed, and they're still alive and kicking, in that native tongue, and to also be able to snap back sometimes when you know, I'm a little petty, I'm not gonna lie. And so it feels good to play the role that most people think I am, and then you know, respond accordingly with that second language that I take great pride in. So that's a little bit of who I am, and I'm sure I'll elaborate a little more as we go forward.
Thank you so much, Donray. So our event today is in honor of Latin Hispanic Heritage Month. In speaking with students and employees about the culture, we often are asked, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Hispanic, what's the difference? Doctora, do you mind jumping in with this first question?
Okay, so well, Hispanic was a terminology brought in, I think it was in the 70s, right, to describe this group of people that had a language connection to Spain, right? So there's this Spanish speaking connection. So that's how it developed. I always looked at it as Hispanic, right? I never liked that word because I was like, well, did they see my people and we're like panicking? Like, where did this word come from? But we all know it comes from Hispaniola and identifies with Spanish speaking. And then in the 90s or 2000s, I think Latino came about, Latina, to describe the population connected to Latin America, which then included Brazil. Hispanic doesn't include Brazil because it's not Spanish speaking. Latin America does, but it's still a weird word to use, right? Because it also connects to the Caribbean or the Caribbean, but Jamaica doesn't speak Spanish, right? And doesn't identify using Latino. Barbados, Trinidad, Tobago, even Belize, none of them really consider themselves Latino, even though they would be connected to that word to describe identity. Then you move into the 2018 where Latinx came, because neither one of those words, well, at least Latino, did not connect with a non-binary, gender fluid group of people that we know we have, right, in our groups. So Latinx came about to cover that non-binary, gender inclusive definition for identity in the community. But when you use Latinx when you're speaking Spanish, it's not as smooth to use. So it hasn't caught on with a lot of people. It hasn't caught on with the older generation who is, connected to Latino. But the newer group does, and I feel that pride in finding a way to identify and still hold on to the heritage and the culture. The one that you didn't add, which is kind of even newer than that, is Latine with an E, that is starting to be used more often because it is kind of smoother in the language. When you speak in Spanish, there is some neutrality in it. It is used in some words now to describe a group without gender. If you don't add the la or el in front of it, like estudiante, that word alone without la, el in front of it is a more inclusive word, gente. So Latine might be the one that'll catch on for people, I'm not sure. But those are the different ways that other people try to describe us. That's how they were created, right? I prefer being called Puerto Rican or being called Vivian, right? If you want to know what and that's how you should treat everybody, is what do you want to use to describe you? And if they say Latino, fine. If they say Latinx, but let people describe themselves for themselves.
Thank you. We also have a follow-up question. So in referencing the gender dynamic in our language, it would be great to add why you chose doctora over doctor.
So you see, my pronouns are she, her, ella. So doctora fit. So for some people, doctorex, doctore might be more appropriate for them. But I felt that I needed to honor my mom, my dad, my grandmother, who helped me through my life choices and decisions that I've made, my aunts, my uncles, and doctora really spoke to that more than doctor. So it's really interesting. A little story behind it is when I first started using it, a few people emailed me privately to say, hey, I think you made a mistake in your signature. There's an A. I don't know if it was an autocorrect or like, well, autocorrect to what? I'm like, no, it's correct. And well, why would you add an A? And I would have to explain it. But it's caught on. Other people who have their doctorate in the district that are female are now using doctora. And others call me that. They don't technically call me Dr. Vivian. They say doctora. And I really appreciate the acknowledgement.
Thank you. So this question is for all panelists. A topic that has been getting much attention recently is the focus on anti-racism work in our communities. That brings us to the discussion of colorism in the Latinx community, which is a real challenge with our people. For all panelists, can you speak a little bit about the phenomenon and how to address it?
I spoke too much. Go ahead.
I think I'll kick this off. I mean, that's a lot. This is a good question. I'll start from a personal standpoint where it's prevalent, although it's been normalized, at least in my situation, to the point where because of the nicknames I grew up with and everyone grew up with was so specific to an attribute of yourself, whether it was Colochito, Negrito, Chelito, all these Spanish nicknames that were literally describing some aspect of you. And so since everyone got it, it was normalized. It seemed a part of it. It wasn't looked at or given a negative connotation. However, you don't live forever in these communities that you grow up in that feels like family. I was raised by a village. The entire block had the opportunity to let me have it if I did something wrong. And same thing, my grandmom could do whatever she wanted to another kid on the block if he was acting up. It was a community environment. And that affectionate terminology, it was normalized, but it wasn't, I wouldn't say it was harmful, at least at the time. As we become the majority in this country, as we work towards that, a lot of our cultural norms are starting to bleed into commonality throughout the community. And so when folks outside of that community begin to hear or internalize what's going on, but they don't have the cultural background or upbringing to understand where it's coming from, I think that's where the dangers arise. And I'm not trying to excuse anyone, but and as a result, it's been, I think I can honestly say that there's been more colorism on my Latino side than with respect to my Black side, that I've experienced more explicitly than over the course of my career, especially in education. And it's, unfortunately, I experienced it a lot from my own Latinx family. And so I can speak to on several occasions being not included or not asked, or even once found out that who I was, or when I volunteered to be a part of various efforts or whatnot, folks in the Latino community trying to find others and settling for myself. And so the work that needs to be done, or that I've embarked on, is trying to educate those who want to be educated first, who are open to educating, not burning the energy, trying to be loved or accepted by folks who aren't there yet. That's not my job to get them there. Where I'm at, from where I sit. From where I sit now is to work with those who are open to moving. That's where my efforts are going into. That's where I'm pouring my energy into, and whether it's on committees, whether it's on conversations like this, or whether it's actually on not similar to, I don't know about this Hispanic Heritage Month. I know about it. I know we have specific celebrations, but if this is the only month that we are having these conversations, then I'm failing my community. And so this type of conversation is ongoing. And as a matter of fact, on my campus last year, I led conversations, a group of faculty and staff, and we met on a monthly basis to discuss not only our own experiences here, but to have that safe room, that safe space to really, I guess one could say, call each other out, but to put on the table their experience and those who are at the root of that, to see how we can work on it together. It's not your job as an individual to fix the problems of a campus, of an entire community, but I do find it my responsibility to have those conversations and not put it all on the current majority, the white folks, the Black folks, or anyone else. I want to make sure I'm taking care of home first, because that solidarity is so strong. And once we're together and understanding what's going on, then it's easier to have those conversations, because what I'm doing with a group or an individual may be completely turned over or reversed by their interaction with someone else who may not feel or have the same perspective, or even see me as a Latino themselves. So I work with those who are open to it. And then as a communal group, the idea is to then have a more elaborate impact on my campus, at least here at Kutztown University.
If I can jump into that too, because there's something that Donray had mentioned there, which is holding space to have the conversation. And then hopefully, and it really great, for example, this afternoon, we have 55 attendees here, like fantastic. Thank you everyone for joining us. That hopefully there's something from this message that you can take away from the conversation. All we can do is to hold space to have these conversations, and hopefully we can have the impact and can just build upon each other, right? So with respect to the question, with regards to colorism, I know all three of us, when we were preparing for the conversation today, we all kind of took a deep breath of, okay, how are we going to answer this? And the colorism dynamic is one of a number of things in the Latinx and the Latina community that we have to have conversations around. And oftentimes there's so much to this. Some of it has to do with the impacts of race. I think being in America, we sometimes have an understanding or a belief that race is only an American phenomenon. Race is a global phenomenon. And the slave trade, for example, that was a global phenomenon. That had an impact on a global level. So of course, it's going to have an impact in the Latina, Latinx community. And as Donray had mentioned, with respect to some of the nicknames, right? Negrito, which means black, right? And some of those other nicknames, some of them, of course, are speaking to your skin color and worth around what skin color you identified with. I mentioned in my story in the opening, some of the dynamics at play with respect to language. That's also a part of the mix. It's also where we identify, right? We have a little internal struggle and challenge sometimes when you get a Venezuelan in the room, a Puerto Rican in the room, you get a Guatemalan in the room, a Mexicano in the room. We all have our own stuff that we're dealing with. And sometimes we're kind of clashing because we are this and you're not this. So all of it, again, as Donray mentioned, we have to at least talk about it during Latin Hispanic Heritage Month, at least honor it here. But this isn't, we have to do this every day, right? This is work that we all have to do to be able to see ourselves and to see that we're all genuine and authentic in unique in our own distinct ways. And I think of the words of Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, where he says, before we can get to a place where race isn't a thing, we have to talk about why race is a thing. And that's what we're doing now.
Thank you, Doctora.
Lupita Nyong'o says colorism is the daughter of racism. So it's clearly connected and tied, and we can't talk about it without talking about anti-Blackness when we talk about colorism. So being Latina or Latina is a beautiful thing when we are brought together, but the truth is we're very, very different as a group, right? So you brought up, Scott, Guatemalan, Mexican, Honduran, Venezuelan, Puerto Rican, Dominican. There are times where I am way more connected to the Caribbean than I am to some of the South American countries. We eat a lot of the same food. Our music is similar. The Africanness in the islands are a lot more similar. So there are times where I feel like, well, I'm more Caribbean than I am Latin, right? So all of those things have a play in it, but we also cannot deny that the more we talk about cultural nationalism, the more that pulls us into that anti-Black discussion, right? I talked before we came on where when I was much younger, I had written a poem where I clearly say I'm too dark for one, I'm too light for the other, features from both. Doesn't that make you wonder? I'm a proud product of all three is what the poem was. And then as I got older and started learning more about my history, I started to realize they say that I am really not Puerto Rican because I wasn't born there, that in fact, I am really American because I happen to be born there. So the play in all of that really is hard for us when we're trying to figure out our way, what group we identify, and when other groups try to tell us who to identify with, right? Well, Donray, you're Black, you ain't Latino, you ain't Puerto Rican. I've heard that before. Well, you act like us, Vivian, you Black, you're not Puerto Rican. So having to navigate that is not an easy road. And it continues to play into colorism, continues to play into anti-Blackness. And we have to not play the game. We have to pull out of that and not play that game, because it also puts us and pits us against our African-American family. And that's not a position that I am playing in.
Thank you, Doctora. So for all panelists, continuing the discussion of colorism, anything that you can or want to add about colorism, about your homelands, and how colorism kind of affects your homelands, and Donray, your time over in Honduras as well.
I can't wait to hear about his time in Honduras. So.
Well, first I'll talk, yes, I'll get on that, but I'll tell you what, growing up, and I can remember the Sábado Gigantes and every single novela ever that we watched every single night. And I never saw anyone with my complexion. It just doesn't happen. And to the day, till today, with the exception of some folks in the reggaeton space, I mean, you're hard pressed to find them. And I don't know if, you know, Celia Cruz was always my favorite because she was the queen, which she was, or it's because she had that darker complexion, but it's hard to find, to see us out there. And that has always been an issue that I've had. And I don't know how to even begin working towards that. But what I found is it's not exclusive to PR, to Puerto Rico. And so when I went to Honduras, I went there right out of after undergrad, and I taught in a bilingual school. And there, Spanish, I developed my Spanish quickly. With less than 3 months, it was boom, because it was already in there. And it was similar there. I mean, it was, now I was well respected and regarded there. I even have a goddaughter there. It became my family, so much so that I went back again for another year, and probably would be living there, married and all, if not for family reasons to come home. But because it's definitely third world, and where I stayed in Comayagua, it is, there are not a lot of affluent families. And so who you are, how you conduct yourself, and what you do as a profession really supersedes the colorism down there. However, once you're on the same level as folks, that's where it comes back into play. But being a teacher there is highly regarded. It comes right after the profession of being a doctor. And so it's something that I garnered respect from everyone. So I can't say that I experienced it directly, but I did witness it on a daily basis, whether it be with taxi drivers or with other native teachers sometimes. And there's one in particular that I can think of who always got the brunt end of everything, the additional classes. She had to work harder, work longer sometimes. She literally taught, the 1 year I was there, taught 3 more classes per semester than anyone else for no additional pay. And she was the one darker Hondureño, darker Honduran who worked there. And in my conversation with her, she shared that's why. And she wasn't mad about it. She just shared that that's the way it's been her whole life. That blew me, that blew my mind, because my experience up to that point was that this is where I needed to be. This was a safe haven. This is where they finally appreciated me for who I was. So my personal experience was not the norm, but it's all I had known until I had that conversation with Mercedes. And so that opened my eyes up even further when I came back here to be an advocate, because what I do, what I experience is not going to be anyone else's necessarily, especially with the same exact folks. And that is a tough lens to really see, to see life through, which is recognizing that what you're actually witnessing, what you are perceiving live in reality may not be someone else's with that same individual. And that was a weird situation to be in. So being Black or darker down there was not favorable, but an American teacher who is Black was above being a darker, a trigueño, as they refer to, or trigueña in the Honduran culture. It was just an extremely unique experience, to where I finally wasn't on the bottom of the totem pole like I was in this society per se, but yet I felt a responsibility because I did not appreciate being elevated while other folks who share my complexion were dealing with the things that I was dealing with back home.
Thank you, Donray. So we're going to move on to the conversation about equity. First, what is it and what is it not? And then how do we build equity into our educational systems while removing the barriers that limit student success, specifically for our Latinx students? Scott, do you mind starting us off with this one?
I got a lot in my head right now, just hearing everything that we just shared. You know what I'll share first, and there was actually a question and a comment in the chat. We're doing our best to address everything that's in there. There's a lot of really good stuff in there, and I think it had something to do with creating inclusive curriculums to be more responsive to the diversity that we have in our schools, whether it's K-12, like where Doctora is, or in higher education, like Donray and I are. I think this leads then into an equity piece. I think for a long time in the history of the academy, as educators, we've had a one-size-fits-all approach to education, and that's equal, right? We're going to treat everyone the same. And as a mentor of mine would always say is, Scott, I don't want to give everyone the same size shoe. I want to give you a shoe that fits. That's equity. Unfortunately, the term equity is now getting really confused, and folks are starting to make up some really weird assumptions of what the term equity is. And it's coming from a place and recognizing that we're not all the same. And we know this when we were children and when we're in the K-12 space, that some gravitate towards music, some gravitate towards sports, some gravitate towards the sciences, to language arts and all those different things. So in some respects, equity is recognizing that and then adjusting our instruction and the supports that we have for students, for you too, in the words of St. Francis of Sales here at the university, so you can be who you are and be that well. So that in a lot of ways is what equity is. And for me as an educator, there's so much to unpack to answer this question. One, when we're thinking about our Latino, Latina, Latinx students, I think that was another question in the chat about how do you address students. That's one of the ways in which I do it. I just roll off all three. Is to recognize the variance in our experiences. Again, move away from an equality perspective about who we are and get into recognize that we are all unique. And this is everything from our culture to our food and everything in between. That yes, even though the four of us, right, Naomi, yourself included, we all identify and we all celebrate Latin Hispanic Heritage Month because it's who we are, but we all have different things that make our own culture so unique. Right. In Venezuela, we have arepas, right? When we're talking about food. If you go to Colombia, arepas are a little bit different. It's a little sweeter. They like to put cheese and sugar and honey and stuff in there. But again, if we have this one size fits all approach to how we support students, we think that, well, if we just cover this, that's going to cover everybody. And that's not necessarily the case. So I think it's the power of representation, making sure that our stories are present in our educational experiences. That's the curriculum question that we saw in the chat. And that matters. That matters. For me, I remember as a young child, actually I was a teenager at the time, that representation happened in a number of different ways. One of them was in sports. I remember when I was a teenager and I saw Carl Herrera. He's the first Venezuelan basketball player to ever compete in the NBA. He actually was the first Venezuelan to win an NBA championship. I remember that moment and seeing him on the basketball court with the Venezuelan flag. That mattered to me. It let me know that I could exist in that space, right? Those examples are multiple. We can all speak to that. And that's just one example of that power of representation, that if we have our stories present in that educational experience, it lets me know, it lets other students know that I'm valued and that I'm capable of greatness. That's what it's all about.
Thank you, Scott. Doctora?
I don't know if there's much else to add to that. Just always remembering the uniqueness in our students, having them, the ability for them, their voice to be heard, right? We can, as adults and educators who've been around for a while, can say what we think we know, but we don't know until we ask students, what do they need? What do they want? How do they see it happening? And let them speak for themselves. And, often I hear, well, Vivian, we can't individualize everything. Well, maybe one kid said it, but I'm sure there's a bunch of other ones that haven't said it that feel that way. So trying to meet that need isn't going to be exclusive for that one student. So we have to always remember that representation matters. So the more we can put people who look like them in positions that they don't typically see, will be helpful, will help with equity as well. And again, speaking on colorism in this panel, we can't forget anti-racism when we talk about equity and addressing anti-Blackness.
Thank you. Donray, and then all the panelists. As we advance the work of inclusivity in our schools, we need to create space for our colleagues and families to grow as well. What have you found to be the biggest aha moment in creating better understanding about DEI, belongingness, and our Latinx experience?
Well, I think I kind of touched on it a little bit, but it's recognizing that your truth, as accurate as it may be, is not going to be the truth of everyone else. You know, and even how I perceive the ongoings. There's colleagues that I have who identify as white, and I have to accept that and understand and hear them out as to why that is the case, because while I may not deep down inside understand or agree with it, I do recognize that one individual I'm encountering in this instance is reflective likely of a percentage of the students that I work with on a daily basis. And it's a percentage of students that I will work with in the future. And so casting my personal preferences or biases or opinions on them would be assuming that I understand, or that I've been through, or that I see the world through the lens that they do. So the biggest aha is recognizing that as much or as little as I may agree with certain other individuals' perception of who they are from a historically Latino perspective, that they have a voice, they have an opinion, and I'm not one to dictate what theirs is. My role is to understand so that I can better serve anyone else that comes my way in that same aspect. And that clearly has been the most aha moment, because I didn't even realize that until I was close to 40 years old, to be honest. As long as I've been in the space and working with students and families, I thought, you know, we were all coming from the same perspective, and that's not the case. Not everyone perceives their interactions in the way that I do, or recognizes some of the implicit biases that may be taking place on a daily basis in their presence, and respecting an individual's opinion of the same bloodline who doesn't, you know, observe their history the same way you do.
Thank you. Scott?
I don't have anything to add from what Donray just mentioned, but another aha moment that I'll share, and there's so much that we're talking about here that can be a class in and of itself, right? So the colorism discussion that we had a little bit earlier, in my head, I was thinking about, wow, if I was a poli-sci professor talking about the impacts of colorism in American politics right now, I mean, there's so much you could do there. But with respect to the aha moment, right now, there's a lot of uncomfortable conversations or avoided conversations around everything that we're discussing here. And one of the aha moments that I have had is leaning into that, leaning into those uncomfortable feelings. And I think a couple of comments in the chat that we noticed was the opportunities that these discussions have in us being able to find commonality. And I think that's so important. Now, I want to put some caution on here, right? That the aha moment lives in that uncomfortable feeling. And folks generally don't want to engage because they think that DEI conversations are going to separate us. And that's not the case. Now, are we going to have some differences, some uniquenesses that might differentiate us in different ways? Yes. But as we had shared a few moments ago, once we start living through that, then we might see some common threads that, even though you might not hail from Venezuela and had English as a second language, that there might be parts of my story that resonate with you. That's the value of this work, right? I think that's the value of this work, while also being able to recognize that when we hold space to listen, to understand, and not listen to respond, we start to see that some of the changes and modifications that we can make in our educational environments can be so subtle, but yet so impactful. And that's where the aha moments live, right? It's simple things like, wow, just defining what Latino, Latina, Latinx, and Hispanic is, what sort of an impact that can have on an educator, right? Those moments to just define and understand can really have long-lasting impact.
Very quickly, my aha moment was really understanding intersectionality, on how all these things have a certain impact separate, but when you put, you know, race with gender, or race with sexuality, ethnicity, that it changes the outcome dramatically, and that we have to pay attention to all of that at all times. And hey, I love this younger, like I hear often about the young, oh, the millennials and the other groups, they're so opinionated. They will leave a job just because. And I love this group of students. They empower me to do things that I probably wouldn't have done in at their age. That has been an aha moment for me. My kids who are millennials tell me, Mom, I'm not putting up with that, so I'm not going to take that job. Where I would be like, no, you're going to take that job and you're going to look for another one. And I have to respect that they will not lessen who they are. They will not become smaller for people who don't understand them. They will remove themselves from the situation where growing up, that's not how we were raised, right? You put up with it until you find something else. And I appreciate that. I don't know if my pocket's going to appreciate that when they don't leave my house, but but I do respect that. So those were aha moments for me.
Thank you, Doctora. All our panelists here have extensive experiences in community engagement. How do we support our communities with our historically excluded populations? Doctora, would you like to start off?
So how do we support our communities that have a historic, for me, I feel like that's where my work has lied. Like it's been rooted in helping, supporting, living within that community, and always being able to, if not myself, hear them and listen, finding who in the community hears and listens to them that can tell me what is needed, and then going out and coming back to the district and saying, this is what we're being told is how to support the community. Not what we said they needed. This is what they said they needed. So if I can't do it myself, then find the person within that community that can do that, to maintain connection, and be able to support the community the way they say they need to be supported.
Thank you. Donray?
It's hard to expound upon that. I just found, and I kind of alluded to it a little bit in my response in the chat, that I think technology can play a tremendous role in what we're trying to get done. There is a generation that has a power that none of us before them have. And so all these youngsters trying to make a difference, trying to give them our playbook when we fought with, slingshots, and they've got the bazooka of social media where they have an outreach and a connection and availability and resources that we didn't have is unfortunate, or doing them a disservice. I think there has to be we have to listen. When I say we, I mean the current leaders, those in position of influence, have to do more listening and less directive. I think there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be gained. And I echo Doctora's sentiments in that this generation, they're moving the vessel. They just need some help and guidance and planning to rebuild this world that they are intent on tearing down when I talk about traditional structures. And so I think it's incumbent upon us as those in positions of wisdom to listen more than direct. I think we'll get further as we go forward.
Thank you. Scott, anything you would like to add? And I just kind of want to add to that question a little bit to our DSU community, how we can support our community here on campus.
Yeah, I think, and I appreciate the modification of that question too, Naomi. It's a phrase that I know that the three of us, Donray, Doctora, and I have discussed separately, is it's not done for us if it's done without us. And again, when we talk about how the academy and education as a whole is generally operated, we know that the history of education has generally been white male dominated. Let's just speak truth to reality, okay? So as we have become more diverse, sometimes the way in which we operate has not changed to recognize the variance that is now the diverse populations that are here. So the best ways in which we can serve our students, all of our students, and our employees, our colleagues, our faculty, and our staff is to recognize this and to change, right? To make sure that leadership, decision makers are reflective of the populations in which we are supporting and serving and partnering with. And that, I think, speaks to that phrase that it's not done for us if it's done without us. And as we do that, we can become informed with things such as diverse organizations and diverse institutions are actually more dynamic. They are more profitable in the business space. I know we have some colleagues here that are from business and industry, and some of our faculty. We know that the Deloittes and the Forbes of the world have spoken to that. So lean into this work, lean into these opportunities, lean into the change that is upon us. There is so much good on the other side of this, but it does require a little bit of a risk. And partner with us. Let us be a part of that change. And there's so much good that can be done on the other side. And the last thing with this, Naomi, is that it's not changing, right? We know the numbers. We're going to be even more diverse as the years go on. So that's also the business case along with the hard case for DEI.
Thank you, Scott. Before we move on to the last question, I just wanted to ask the panelists if they want to look into the chat and maybe answer any of the questions that kind of popped up that maybe we didn't get a chance to discuss.
Naomi, I see one in here that was speaking to a little bit about let's see if I can find it. If I can, even to my fellow panelists, the rise in identity sensitivity and recognizing that all people may not be a believer or claim a spiritual or religious identity. How do you see it, if at all, religious tolerance growing from your experiences? As I read that question, I think of the impact that a religious identity has in the Latin culture, right? I know for me, growing up in Venezuela and in my mother's household, it was very Roman Catholic centric, but also the intersection of indigenous knowledge and spiritual beliefs as well. So I'm just kind of processing that question and thinking about, with respect to the Latino, Latinx community, I think that spirituality and religion in so many ways is at the core of many of our identities. Curious what Dr. and Donna Ray feel about that.
I tried to answer a little bit in the questions about spirituality, because I had said I'm really not uncomfortable, but I don't like tolerance, right? Like you're putting up with something, but I do agree. I think it was Kevin Wass says, at least it's a place to start. If we could at least have people agree to tolerate. I just am so believing in letting people be who they are identity-wise, and religion and spirituality is part of your identity. So allowing people to decide for themselves what that is and being okay with that.
Thank you. Any other questions we would like to look at before that last one for the evening?
I think Luis Martinez asked about the phrase. I think it was, if it's not for us, if it's not done with us, it's not for us. I forget how it's said. I think I flipped it.
Yeah, it's not done for us if it's done without us. I put it in the chat. Thanks, Luis, for sharing that.
Okay, so lastly, we look to adjourn for the evening. We'd like to conclude with some final thoughts from each panelist. So if we can start with Doctora, then Scott, and then Donray.
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Sure.
I was trying to answer something in the questions.
No problem. So we're just looking for concluding with some final thoughts from each of you of tonight's conversation.
So my final thoughts is I'm just thankful that for the people that took time to be with us and just be a part of the conversation. I wish I could see you. I wish I could engage with you. And if there's anything from me that you take away is that, allow people to be who they need to be, how they need to be it. It does not hurt you at all to allow that to happen. Share stories and share space with people who are not like you, and so that you can understand each other and grow and learn.
Thank you. Scott?
Yeah, share stories. And as I was preparing for this, I was actually having a conversation with a colleague yesterday, and I was reminded of the Carl Herrera story that I had shared before. And the more I actually reflect on that, I recognize that the importance that moment actually had in my young self and my identity development. Because that was the first time in which I saw someone when I moved to this country with that same identity as me, and also being celebrated. I remember the commentators during the broadcast talking about that moment and him with the flag. So I say all that because, again, representation matters. So to honor that. So those who are on this Zoom, if you are an educator, to think about ways in which you can diversify your curriculum, that matters. That matters in so many ways, and to not make assumptions. And I know for me, I grew up in a community that was not very ethnically diverse. And even though that I present as brown skinned, I was seen as Black. So if you're not, as my sister so eloquently said a couple of years ago, if you haven't been exposed to the full colors of the rainbow, if you will, sometimes you make some assumptions, and sometimes those assumptions can have some harm. And I think when we are able to create these spaces to build this understanding and awareness, we can know better so we can do better. And I'm just really glad to have been able to be a panelist, to be with Dr. and Donray and Naomi. Snaps to you for hosting. And many thanks to everyone who was able to join us this afternoon for this discussion.
Thank you. Donray, any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Sure, I think the other panelists spoke to the group very well. So I'm going to speak to a more specific demographic, because I think it's very important that they hear this message. There's two ways to take some of the negative appeal or negative attention that you receive from your own folks. And the longer you allow it to have a negative drag on your being, the less you'll get to enjoy your life. And so I was proud that I eventually stopped holding it against others or disliking folks or whatnot, and move forward. But if you feel as though you are not accepted by any one group, or that you have to try to be something when just being yourself isn't enough, please know that you're not alone. And that's why these spaces for conversation are important. This day and age, I think there's a whole lot more conversation and welcomeness to inclusivity. And so hopefully there is an individual, an adult, an educator that you've built a relationship with, that you could at least have those conversations there and find a safe space to share. I can assure you, you're not alone in your journey, but that day will come where you look past those who look to bring you down, and those bright days will be that much more enjoyable.
Thank you, Donray. And thank you to everyone who's here with us tonight, listening to our panel. A special thank you to Dr. Robledo Shori, Scott Blair, and Donray Bennett for speaking with us tonight on this important topic. Just wanted to also share that the recording of our panel today can be found later this week on our Office of DEI YouTube channel. And thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.